Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session at Urban Arc. Before we go into the session, I just want to take a minute to announce our proceedings from Urban Arc 2020. They're available up on our website, and we'll put here's the URL, and this is what they're on the IIHS Knowledge Gateway, and we'll also leave the URL and the DOI for you in the chat, and for you to sort of access later on. And so without further ado, I'd like to move over to our final panel for this, for Urban Arc 2021. We've had 3 days of very fruitful, very engaging and exciting discussions on the theme of urban imaginaries. And as we close the conference today, we'd like to look forward to what it takes to imagine an urban future that reflects sort of shared understandings and goals of sustainable development and sort of equitable urbanization. Our final panel today will draw on their vast experience, not only from research, but also from practice, to reflect on what we need to do to start charting a path forward for a sustainable urban future. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Aromar Revi, the director of IIHS, who will chair and be discussant for this panel. So over to you, Aro.
Thanks, Neha. It's a pleasure to sort of join you at the end of this conference. We've had a fairly intense 3 days with people coming in from pretty much across all geographies, all the way from Australia. And then this morning, we've woken up colleagues in the US. So we've got a number of sort of time zones functioning and operating here. This is the last panel, which is sort of pulling together this conference on urban imaginaries, on sort of trying to look at the connection between academics, research, a practice around the idea of what is now called new urban science. I have a transcontinental panel here, which sort of goes from Asia, where I am just now, to Africa, Europe, and then to North America. And we have some of, let's say, 4 leading scientists, researchers, academics who've done seminal work in this space. So I'll quickly sort of introduce them. There's Debra Roberts, who is a life scientist and an environmental scientist, but has her day life is kind of very interesting. She's a practicing urban official. She's the head of sustainability and resilience at the University of Durban. And she spent many years doing cutting edge work there on biodiversity, on resilience, and of course, on climate. She's one of the leading climate scientists from South Africa, one of their negotiators for the UNFCCC. And over the last many years, she's been carrying, I would say, a fairly challenging burden as the co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC, where she's sort of one of the 6 co-chairs who pulled together IPCC's seminal 2018 report on 1.5 degrees centigrade, and is now trying to shepherd the sort of current cycle towards its completion over the next couple of years. And then we have Jose Lobo from Arizona, from the School of Sustainability at Arizona State. Jose, interestingly, is a physicist by initial training, went on to do work in regional science, and of course, he's best known for his work on urban science and economic systems, and has led some very interesting initiatives across the US for the NSF, looking at pedagogy and research in the urban science space. Michael Keith is from Oxford. Michael, again, to show us the diversity of this panel, he is an anthropologist, but apart from his sort of academic engagement, he's the director of the Peak Urban Research Program, which is one of the more interesting research programs across the world at the moment, that is looking at a whole range of questions, but primarily at what I would call the confluence between sustainability and urban science. He's worked extensively on migration, but most interestingly, he's also been a deep practitioner in the urban space. He's a former politician, was for 20 years the mayor of East London. So he knows, multiple sides and facets of the process. And then finally, Louis Bettencourt, again, another physicist, the director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago, has done extensive work at Santa Fe on complex systems, and of course is one of the most sort of well-known sort of researchers and authors in this space, and is sort of widely respected across the world for his work on urban systems. So we have a fairly wide range of backgrounds and processes. I'm Aromar. I'm the director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and my own research is, I guess, at the overlap between sustainability science, which I've been kind of working on for a fairly long time now, almost 30 years or so. Climate science, again, with Debra and others working with the IPCC and other institutions on both the adaptation and the mitigation side, and of course, urban science. And since a lot of my work is with institutions and with policymakers and practitioners, I would say political economy is another element that I work with. So we have a wide-ranging panel here, and I thought this would be interesting to give us a sense of the landscape that in some ways is deeply connected in different parts of the world, but obviously is very different because our contexts are very different. In an urbanizing world, I guess one of the claims or the challenges for us is in a world that is either deeply urban in Latin America, Europe, and North America, or massively urbanizing, as in East Asia, now South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I guess one of the questions is, do we need sort of a new urban science for a new urbanizing world that, unfortunately, in spite of 5,000 years of urbanization, we don't necessarily have a very good handle on? There are a range of critical questions that we're trying to wrestle with that I guess we'll touch on a little bit, and each of our journeys can kind of speak to that. I think at a very high level, something that's in a sense taken for granted in many parts of the world, and that is that the world will become urban and will become urbanized. And I think China is going through this in a very real manner, the largest urbanization in history at the moment. This appreciation that everything will work towards mega urban regions in China of maybe 15, 20, maybe even 50 million people as an inevitability is something that I think is worth examining. This is a deep question for us in South Asia, because we are still only at the moment 1/3 urban and 2/3 rural. As fossil fuels are being withdrawn from the system, hopefully for all of our sake, and to try and maintain some degree of sanity on the 1.5 side, the question is, it's not only fossil fuels that are driving emissions, but fossil fuels are in many ways, whether it's coal or oil and gas at the current point of time, have driven the kind of urbanization that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. The concentration at one end, but also urban agriculture, which is also driven by both fossil access for fertilizer and fossil energy for pumping water. So if the fossil fuels sort of are taken out of the system relatively quickly, one of the big questions is, how are we going to actually be able to provide the ecosystem services, the food, the fiber, etc., that will be required for a population of 8 or 10 billion people. So in some senses, they are, at least as far as we're concerned, in some parts of the world, I would say this is quite important in sub-Saharan Africa and in many parts of Asia, with a couple of billion people who actually need food. The question is, where is it going to come from? And we've seen with the sort of the demise of the Soviet Union and the Chinese great concern just now of feeding their populations, the question of how much rural and how much urban, where does agriculture come from? It may not be possible to have high-tech precision agriculture everywhere. So that's, I think, one of the larger questions. How does one look at urban systems all the way from large mega urban regions, metropolitan areas, all the way down to other things? And how do they evolve in different parts of the world with different histories, different geographies, and different resource bases, especially in a world where ecologically we're going to be seeing the limits pushed very dramatically. A 2-degree rise on the average in some places means a 4 or 5 degree rise already towards the poles and other locations. And then on top of that, you have urban heat islands. So dramatic ecological changes. That's one set of questions. The other thing, which I think many people on this panel have worked on, is a question of density and scale, of agglomeration economies. And of course, one of the classic questions that have been dealt with for a long time in this space, and that is, are there optimal densities and scales? What are the best things as far as that's concerned? What I call the balance between the light and the dark side of urbanization. The light side being the agglomeration economies that give us, the ability to be able to bring in infrastructures, to be able to enable economic activity to become much more effective. So economies of scale and scope. But what we've seen, especially during COVID, is the other side of urbanization really showing itself. And we do know from urban history, and certainly from our about 100 years of economics in this, that cities do concentrate poverty. We absolutely see that in the global south, and the global south is pretty much present in all parts of the world, including North America and Europe at the current point of time. But they also concentrate risk, and they in fact, in some senses, many urban systems are driven by being organized around inequality, which is one of the critical questions that we're seeing being asked in terms of governance and organization around COVID, because COVID kind of has thrown up all the fault lines that we've seen pretty much across the world. So I would say that's the second set of questions that some of us are working on. The third, of course, especially critical in the global south, but also, I mean, in the south, is the question of informality. So the assumption that urban systems will become more and more formal, that the standard model of development, where you go from primary to secondary to tertiary sector activity, where eventually everybody's sitting around and either they have leisure or they're working on all kinds of sort of very high-end things, is not necessarily true. So the question of the future of work and the nature of how work is organized is very critically related to how urbanization is going to, or currently is going to be worked out, especially in the context of precarity. Inequality I've dealt with, that's an absolutely central question in some senses. It goes back to our conception of governance of urban centers, literally going back 2,500 years to city-states and the development of nation-states as far as that's concerned. The other two things that I think are useful to look at, and we deal with this quite a lot, especially in the climate space, is what we call today the urban and the infrastructure transition. So, how does that play itself out in a network world? Can we kind of, is there some forms of substitutability between physical flows and information flows and locations? Is the structure of urban centers and the nature of work and planning actually going to shift itself out? There is a new discourse after COVID, basically speaking about the fact that, in effect, the old forms of urbanism will not actually come back. And I think, given the the momentum or inertia of many urban systems, especially those that are tied in with land and labor markets, and of course infrastructures that persist for a long period of time, I'm a little skeptical about that in certain parts of the world. So, I mean, I just laid out half a dozen different sort of themes that are there, but sitting behind that, I think, is the big political debate that we're having just now. And that is, especially as we're trying to respond to COVID, to sustainability, it's very clear that nation states are incapable of dealing with the kind of complexity that we're talking about. This kind of emergent processes that are there, nation states are not organized in integrated ways. They're organized around, at least the organization of governance, of economic activity, of fiscal relations, are organized around silos, around thematic areas and sectors. And what we need to see is integration in some senses. And in some ways, a lot of the work of people on this panel is about both theorizing and dealing with the practical integration and the challenges of doing that in the real world in some senses. So I think at the heart of it is the big battle for new imaginations of governance, political governance, economic governance, and of course, the relationship between the city and nature per se. And I mean, they're all tied in some ways. So this is a fairly vast canvas. Obviously, we're not going to be able to touch on all of these, but I'm saying these are the kind of practical and theoretical questions we're trying to address in different contexts. Obviously, the big challenge for us is how do we, help develop academics, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and citizens who kind of embrace this in practice over the next 20 or 30 years as the world becomes more urban, or in a sense as parts of it that are sort of diabolically urban start falling apart. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to ask Debra to kind of jump in here, because with her experience and this sort of multiple life of going between being an urban practitioner and a city official during the day and managing high science at night, I'm sure she has interesting reflections on where what are the big questions that we need to address, and how can we sort of pick them up and build them up in the future. So Debra, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ora, and perhaps let me just start off by thanking you for inviting me to be part of the panel. And real thanks to yourself and the team at the Institute for always being so proactive in opening up these very interesting conversations around the urban question. I mean, I think this is very, very important to continue this debate, particularly during the time of the pandemic when so many are distracted. Perhaps let me just start with a reflection. You put out there this challenge of urban science, and I think you crafted quite an eloquent description of the many facets that are engaged when we talk about urban science. But I would offer up, if you look at that phrase urban science, those two things are very uncomfortable partners. If one conceptualizes what urban is and where urban started, and you reflected back that our urban history is some 6,000 years old, and so we've got a very extensive urban history. Urban areas were built up with a certain rationale in mind. They were walled cities to keep out nature. You reflected on the fact that we need to be thinking about how nature is operative in the context of the 21st century city. They started off small. Certainly no one had these huge mega cities in mind. And the idea of science, a point of reflection on urban, is really quite a new creation. You know, I always joke with my staff that when I first engaged with local government, it was during a VAC job, and I sold dog licenses, because that's what local government did, is it licensed things, it put services into the ground. But in effect now, urban areas are the largest socio-ecological system on the face of the earth. They need to be driven by the kind of research and development knowledge that large corporations are using to inform their foresighting processes. And that use of knowledge, that drawing in science, is not something that local governments are necessarily au fait with, or indeed even comfortable with. And if we talk about the high science, so things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the biodiversity equivalent that we have in IPCC, those global assessments all happen at a scale of science that doesn't even acknowledge cities. Those global assessments, in terms of the scale at which they assess, they can't even find cities on the maps. And so they've been quite agnostic as far as urban goes. So you've got a mode of governance and running and building cities, which has in many ways operated outside of the business of science, which is about understanding the structure and behavior of systems. Urban areas are not necessarily thought about themselves as systems, but they very much are systems of nature and society and economies interacting. And then the very high science that we use to inform our policy direction, in fact, has been urban blind for a very long time. So we've got an additional challenge in bringing those two elements together. And as a person who straddles those, I'm a bit like the Colossus. I've got a foot on either side of the harbor. I can tell you those are very uncomfortable fits, and we need to be able to create a discourse, which is why a panel like this is so important, about how you bring those two things together in a comfortable fit. Science also doesn't necessarily like engaging with urban because it's a complex, messy place, and urban doesn't always like engaging with science. I would say that that's the first challenge. The second challenge, as you say, Aro, is the fact that urban, what is urban? It's so different in many parts of the world. And I think what we are seeing, you certainly raised the issue of informality, is people are finding that the structure and behavior of cities are no longer meeting their needs. And this is perhaps most evident in Africa through our large and burgeoning informality. People are literally beginning to build cities for themselves, which is why you see our large informal settlements come up. The economy is not working for them. The infrastructure is either not there or not working for them. They don't have access to governance systems. So people are taking the initiative and beginning to build cities within cities. My own city has about 600 informal settlements. The country, South Africa, only had about 300 when we moved to democracy. So you can see the scale of the urban build that is happening at the individual level. And I think this is something we must also think about, because we assume that cities are built by governments. And I would say to you, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest builders are potentially no longer governments. And in many places, we no longer have the kind of formal control one might imagine a city hall to have over the process of urbanization. So I would say that we've got founding challenges in creating an urban science, but I would also say that the locus of the energy around what is urban is moving and is becoming much more linked to individual need and community need. And then the question is, how does science engage with that? It's difficult enough engaging science with formal government, but how do you bring science in an area of informality? So perhaps I'll leave it there.
Jose, you've sort of pulled together some of the most important documents in this space in the US. Could you take us through, how you got there and where you think this is going?
Yes, thank you. Good blank to all of you. I know for some of you it's evening, for some of us it's morning. And again, I also want to join Debra and thank you, Aromar, not only for the opportunity to join you all in this discussion, but for the effort that you have led. So yes, well, let me just to put my comments on some context. My principal interest in urban science is I have been long interested in the relationship between urbanization and socioeconomic development. And urban science is one of the motivators for developing that, has been trying to integrate many, many different lines of work over the past few decades from many disciplines that have tried to understand that. And we do have a lot of empirical evidence that tells us that over the millennia, cities have been important drivers of socioeconomic development. But so starting from there, I will just talk a little bit about both what I think are sort of the research frontier that we need to move to, and then some institutional challenges in getting to that research frontier. So what I mean by the research frontier is that by now we've studied cities enough, and we have enough theoretical developments that we can more or less with ease explain the obvious success stories. So for example, if we can sketch a fairly convincing story as to why urbanization was so crucial to China's dramatic and spectacular economic success. But at the moment, I will argue what, let's say, this emerging body of work of urban science, which I want to emphasize, builds upon many decades of work across disciplines. What we're not so capable of doing is explaining the non-success story. So for example, why has urbanization not been a driver of socioeconomic development in Mexico? Mexico has one of the highest rates of urbanization in the developing world. And yet, you don't see the signals, the data does not tell you. If you talk to people, if you visit Mexico, you don't see urbanization having had the same role. Certainly has not been the case in Nigeria. And there are a lot of concerns as to whether or not urbanization, if it unfolds along classical lines, so to speak, will also have the same role in India. So I think those of us who have, in one way or another, been developers, practitioners, constructors, promoters of urban science, we really need to make sure that we bring our urban science into contact with difficult cases, cases where our theory breaks down. We must deliberately go there. And I think out of doing that, well, hopefully a better science emerges. But in order to do that, it also means that urban science, which is as a field, it certainly has drawn from the work of a lot of colleagues in the developing world, but it has been by and large driven by work studying the urban centers of Europe, North America. So I think urban science needs to become truly global. Those of us who are building urban science need to deeply dialogue with our colleagues who are studying urbanization in parts of the world where urbanization is not following the script, what I call the Chinese script or the US script. Does not, as I said, those are important cases. I'm not saying that we should forget about the success stories, but I think we need to come a little bit more into contact with challenges. And I think hopefully that will let the science become more robust than it is now. But then that touches on almost surprising institutional challenge. And I say surprising because, at least in the United States over the past 10 years, maybe even more, 15 years, there has been a tremendous enthusiasm on the part of academia, the business press, the popular press on cities and urbanization. I mean, cities have certainly become a very prevalent theme. And yet, at the university level, it has proven somewhat difficult to build new programs to train the next generation of urban scholars to be that which we think they should be: transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, comfortable not only with technical methods, but also with head-on discussing issues of inequality, of racial inequality, sexual inequality. Now, for those of you who are in academia, it might not be surprising that universities don't move very, very fast. There are reasons for that. But what it has meant is that at the moment, at least in the United States, which is the situation I'm more familiar with, there is something of a gap between what I call the verbal enthusiasm for studying in cities and the infrastructure that exists in place at universities like Arizona State or the University of Chicago to actually, well, let's set new programs by which we train students differently so they can study cities differently and engage with urban residents differently. So there is one challenge that I'm involved with, and I'm sure Rich can tell you more about it. And a counterpart for that is that institutionally, when you think of support, and I mean by support, I mean money, support for urban science research is also sometimes at the moment quite problematic. And maybe as an example that I will put for that, because this is an institution that really affects a lot the career of academics in the United States, are our National Science Foundation, which is very important in the life of many academics in the United States, both as a source of funding for research, but also for graduate students. And to put it very, very simply, at this moment, the National Science Foundation doesn't really know how to fund research on cities, which I know sounds like a very strange statement, because after all, the National Science Foundation is full of very smart people, and they've been funding research for a long, long time. But for a variety of reasons, some scientific, some internal, some political, you actually there are not many programs in the National Science Foundation that you can point to will facilitate the pushing forward of urban science. So there are several of us who are engaged in a dialogue with the National Science Foundation about how can the National Science Foundation's funding practices reflect the need to understand cities in this different way. By the way, the fact that the National Science Foundation, from the very beginning, it funds work by US-based researchers abroad. So the National Science Foundation will pay me to go to India. It will not give me money to organize a group of scholars from India so I can learn from them. In fact, maybe I don't need to go to India, but maybe can I have some funding so I can facilitate Indian scholars coming together. So the fact that urban science needs to be global, that urbanization is occurring outside of North America and Western Europe, sometimes bumps up against this very, very straightforward rule: thou shalt only fund US-based researchers. So I think universities and research foundations, we need to engage with them so that they can begin to build structures that will allow for the development of urban science, but as a global practice, not just simply study urbanization in the United States yet again. I'm not saying there are a lot of questions still to be answered about urbanization in the United States, but doing that alone will not really build us an urban science. And maybe one last comment, one thing that I think is an important intellectual development that may have implications for institution and funding has to do with the growing realization that the boundary between the urban and the non-urban might not be as meaningfully strict as we used to. Certainly, when I was a graduate student, I can tell you that you could get a PhD in urban economics and you will never hear anything about the non-urban. I mean, we knew there was the non-urban, but there was this assumption that there was a very sharp barrier. And I think, again, for a variety of reasons, we now have come to understand that the well-being of an individual city, first of all, really is connected to what's going on in other cities. That's easy to understand. But that is also connected to what's happening to what used to be called, maybe a little bit, not very positively, the hinterland. Everything else is not urban. I think at this very moment, that barrier, urban, non-urban, is not useful analytically. It's certainly an impediment to useful policymaking, but it will require many of us who've been studying cities obsessively to begin to think more about, as Aromar was saying, how does the food, the water, the energy, the people that come into cities from non-urban areas, what's going on in those areas? And that's it. And what does it mean to be non-urban? Are there non-urban areas in the United States? I mean, can you point out to population settlements in the United States that are not at all affected by what happens in urban areas? I will argue not. So I think that is one of the current research frontiers that will require us to think anew about that barrier. And so I believe that the utility, the analytical utility of the urban non-urban barrier can also be thrown into question in the developing world. And I believe that also will be a research frontier. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Actually, you know, when we did the last IPCC report, and Debra and I were both on that chapter, what we figured very quickly was that if you go to extreme temperatures, then even an urbanized country would be in such deep crisis, because at 4 or 5 degree elevations, essentially ecosystem services collapse. So the question of that's when the urban and the non-urban are going to get shorted out against each other. I mean, that's just one example. So I think you're absolutely right about that. I think this is not an inevitability. The structures that we have are driven by certain processes, dynamics, history, et cetera. But I mean, just a quick comment. I mean, in India doesn't have a national science foundation. Fine. I think in Africa, maybe 2 countries have national science foundations. So there's an additional challenge to, I mean, at least you have a national science foundation, we last checked, and hopefully it'll come on stream again doing urban stuff quite quickly later this week or next month or something like that. But I mean, this is a significant question in terms of being able to try and, like Debra said, bring science not only to the scientists, but to governments, and then of course, most critically to citizens, because today, both education and science have become much more democratized because of the nature of the networked society that we have. So there are new opportunities there. Michael, you are in I think, a wonderful position to pick up on this, because you actually run a network that connects across the successful geographies, China, and then the ones that are somewhat more challenged, like India and Colombia and South Africa, which is precisely doing, the kind of things that Jose was talking about, looking at sort of urban sciences, sustainability, and embodied thing. But most important, you're sitting in a canonical university, and I think it'll be interesting to see, what your own travails and struggles would be in Oxford of trying to bring urban into sort of into Oxford's life, so to speak. You're on mute, Michael.
Thanks, Harry. And I mean, initially, just to join the chorus of thanks to yourself and Nihar and all the colleagues in Bangalore and Delhi at IIHS, and caps off to the fantastic work that's going on there. It's a privilege to have you as partners on the network that you talked about, which I think a talk about Oxford would be 5 hours on its own, which probably it might even be a rabbit hole for us. But the only thing I would say is that it's probably best captured by a sense that somebody, I'll cut out the expletives, but somebody once said to me, who was very wise, he'd been a chief economist for a certain Latin American government for a long time, but was then head of the development studies department. He said, don't come to the University of Oxford expecting a Weberian bureaucracy. This is a medieval court. He also told me that in a medieval court, he was one of the barons. What he meant by that was that sovereignty was a matter of disciplinary sovereignty, and disciplines created their own empires, and their own empires sometimes spoke to each other, but preferred not to, other than in a spirit of deference and suzerainty, I think that we might call it, which I suppose it sparks the point about the interdisciplinary And very quickly, I suppose you're asking, as some of the things Debra was saying also earlier on resonated with me, because my own story you very kindly mentioned my biographical way into some of these things that I did have done and still live in the East End of London, which was briefly, London was briefly the largest city in the world in about 1901 with a population of about 7 million. It was rapidly overtaken. And lots of people know fairly straightforwardly, London's population declined significantly in the first half of the 20th century, kind of stabilized in the third quarter. But in the fourth quarter of the 20th century, it began to expand pretty rapidly. And the part of London that I was running for a period of time in the late 1990s and first decade of the 2000s had at its peak in the Victorian era a population of about 350, possibly 400,000, depending on how you draw the boundaries. And that actually diminished down to about 180,000. But by the fourth quarter of the 20th century, was growing pretty rapidly. So part of my interest in urban futures was the fact that the part of London that I was responsible for had kind of beacons of prosperity. It was actually part of the Olympic site was there. Most notably, the regeneration of the Docklands involved the second largest financial centre in Europe. The biggest financial centre in Europe was on the eastern edge of the borough. So for a while, interestingly, we had a population, and at the time I was in charge, of about 250,000. It's now about 320,000, growing rapidly, but with simultaneously the highest median income and the lowest average income, and a Gini coefficient of inequality that was the highest in the country, and a population that was majority minority, and over 50% of the school population coming from not just Bangladesh actually, but a particular part of Bangladesh, Sylhet. So a particular kind of context out of which to shape an intervention. And for 7 years, I actually spent my time as chair of something called the Thames Gateway Partnership, which was trying to think, working with the Blair government, Blair Brown government, actually, about what it meant in London to construct a city of over 1 million people to the east of London in a fairly short space of time. Not quite as rapid growth as was seen in other parts of the world at that time, but still not insignificantly so. And in contrast, I guess, to Deborah's point about people thinking governments build cities, part of the debate, and I guess the debate in the global north, which was quite common in much of that time, the last 20 years, was how much of the city, the new city of London, which was growing of its own accord anyway, how much should be controlled by the state and how much should be controlled by the market. A tension which resonated through thinking about urban futures and kind of informed my own interest in urban futures for a significant period of time. So much so, and although you kindly kind of increased my reign to 20 years, I was 20 years in politics, but democratic politics meant that I managed to lose it. I think I won more elections than lost, but it was not an unbroken moment in time. So shortly after, I was twin tracking an academic career, and shortly after one loss, I spent something like 5 to 6 years, mostly in China, in about 2008 to 2013, on a big project, and which came partly through networks of architects in Harvard. I was co-I of this project that I tried with varying success to learn Mandarin, but the project, which was initially based in Beijing and Shanghai, and we produced a book from it, but was also interested in the parts of China where city growth was phenomenal. My colleagues sent me to Shenzhen. We had fantastic colleagues in China, and they sent me to Shenzhen because my Mandarin was rubbish. But people made the point to me that although my Mandarin was rubbish, and that was at times unforgivable in Beijing, in Shenzhen it's actually forgivable more straightforwardly because nobody speaks Hanzi Mandarin in Shenzhen, other than a small minority of urban elites, because the vast majority of people come from all over China, particularly the migration sinks. Shenzhen, unlike London, which took 100 years to get to 7 million, Shenzhen went from a population of about 280,000 at the opening up from Deng Xiaoping in 78 to something between 15 and 18 million by 2010, depending on how you measure the metropolitan area. But the vast majority of that population are migrants. So that interface of migration and urban growth was one of the things that informed my own work, but also structured an interest in urban futures very, very practically. And in my own background, one of the things that was also for a long time of interest was actually working through how one might draw learning that didn't just run what the economists describe often as downhill from global north to global south, but that also might run uphill, not least the ways in which the experiences of China in particular, given I spent a lot of time there, spoke to the experiences of urbanization in the rest of the world, not as straightforwardly transplanting projections of form, urban form, but actually understanding the DNA of what we might call a new urban science. In that sense, I guess in that spirit, one of my people whose work I always follow is Walter Benjamin, who came from Berlin. He said he never understood Berlin until he'd lived in Paris for a long period of time. One can sometimes begin to unpick the DNA of a city by looking at something completely different rather than comparing straightforwardly, which is something we may want to come back to. But I suppose it did produce, particularly when I began to work for a while with a great mathematician who was a network scientist in Oxford called Mason Porter, with some grad students, he's now at UCLA actually, about thinking how network analysis might be used in more interesting ways to think about both mobility futures and urban futures in a slightly different context, which is why the Peak Urban project was structured with great interest and cooperation from people, including yourselves, but also colleagues in China, Colombia, South Africa, but also in Oxford across those domains of power, the sovereign power of different departments, starting with a colleague called Pete Grindrod, and the data analytics team in Oxford, who were actually interested in thinking about the ways in which the new urban sciences might pick up. In particular, I suppose, most straightforwardly about looking at challenges of urban growth globally that were taking place in new geographies, precisely because, very crudely, if you look at the globe, the geographies of urban growth are not straightforwardly around the iconic sites of New York, Paris, London, Tokyo, but obviously are in different parts of the world, but also the ways in which the ability of new forms of methodological approaches to treating new forms of data actually might construct a discipline in a slightly different configuration. This had very immediate relevance in the global north, in the sense we worked with a group called the Foresight, the British government's Foresight program. And a friend and colleague, Alan Wilson, was the chair of the Urban Foresight in the UK, who I worked with for a number of years on that program around trying to think about how the urban sciences might feed into thinking about the British context. But in structuring Peak Urban, we tried to bring together what is effectively the acronym of PEAK, the P standing for an understanding, for bringing together forms of data analytics that have within them the potential to think through notions of prediction based on new methodologies and new data, but also recognizing that city systems are open systems, they're complex systems, they're unstable in some ways, and so they are also subject to emergence, that they are the sites where novelty comes into the world. And the program itself is very much committed to kind of linking up the hard sciences with the humanities and the social sciences. And that sense of emergence actually does travel, I think, between the hard sciences and the cultural and social sciences differently, but also in a context where the A of the acronym focuses on how technological disruptions are part of the processes by which systems are destabilized. And I'll say something about that in a second. But also with a strong commitment to actually link up the new urban sciences with very practical context, the context that gives the K of the acronym based on knowledge exchange, the sense that there is an obligation to think about how knowledge lands in place, but also challenges about thinking about how we make different forms of knowledge commensurable, how one talks to a climate scientist alongside a city planner, alongside a home builder, it actually creates challenges about how we bring together different knowledges in specific contexts. So just to give a couple of examples, if I still have time for a couple of minutes to wrap up my kind of initial intervention, what that means, I suppose, in terms of the new urban sciences, we've got work that, just to give a few examples, my colleague Nevo Cleary, who has now moved on to CASA, working in the unit set up by Mike Batty, one of the kind of primary movers and shakers in the urban sciences. Well, it has been working with Eduardo Laura, the IDB chief economist, around trying to think about how in conventional economics, we think about different economic sectors and geographies that are based on data derived from effectively artificial or synthetic geographies that are based on administrative areas, to use forms of network analysis and big data to try and think about how urban complexity might structure economic growth differently by effectively using forms of data analytics to measure distance and new economic sectors in a way that is data-led and is helpful in understanding and projecting forms of economic growth. In other work that we're doing in China at NYU Shanghai with colleagues in Beida, Beijing Dashui, Peking University, my colleague Cheng He Guan is looking at other ways of how we think about the relationship between the whole city and the neighborhood in context of contemporary urban growth, which are very different from the imaginaries that structured much of the writing about cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, might emerge from actually using the kinds of data online that one gets from the mobilities of people on the ground. So using handheld, the data you get from handheld devices, from mobile phones, from things like DD records, the Chinese equivalent of Uber, to think through the multidimensional constructions of neighborhoods in cities through the patterns of people's use. So actually, rather than trying to think through configurations of the relationship between the part of the city and the whole city through the false geographies of administrative divisions, actually trying to think slightly differently through the behavioral patterns of people's everyday life, and how that constructed slightly different notions of what is a neighborhood, how does the part relate to the whole. Very quickly to finish off, another couple of examples and then a problem, I guess. One, the examples that colleagues in Colombia, where cities like Medellin have been turned around from sites of extraordinary conflict to sites of relative prosperity over the recent past, including through actions of very multidisciplinary urbanists such as our colleague Alejandro Echeverri, who worked both between the academy and the town hall, but also a fantastic group of spatial economists who have background, including in Arizona State and what we call it elsewhere, but who have worked, just to give a couple of examples, using satellite technology to try and model urban growth across the whole of Latin America, using again, a combination of artificial intelligence and data analytics to try and predict the form and detail of urban growth in parts of Latin America, which has been picked up by some of the utilities companies in at least 2 countries in the Latin America already, to try and think through how one might anticipate utilities provision on the ground, deriving pattern from existing trend, but also from lessons that are based on multiple variables of urban growth locally. But also, to use another example, a collaboration between Oxford and AFIT University, the RISE group, has used machine learning from Google Earth data to try to identify both how many parts, this notion of informality is fragmented and fractured in many different ways, but parts of Medellin, the barrios have been kind of gentrified and upgraded. Parts of that domain are subject to extraordinarily inventive economic activity, and basically the project has used machine learning of using Google Earth to kind of re-taxonomize both the scale of informal business activity, but also the scale and the nature of property values across barrios, which tended to be zoned universally, but actually contained great variety. So actually changing the logic of the tax base in Medellin itself. The final thing I'd say, Aro, if I got one.
Yeah, Michael, I think we should move on to Louise, if you don't mind.
Okay, let me stop there.
That would be great. Louise, actually, this is very interesting. So we've heard from the, let's say, the Duchy of Anthropology in Oxford. But I mean, you can see Michael's whole journey there. You heard complexity, you heard prediction, you heard emergence. This is absolutely bang in, I would say your life's work in some senses. Yeah, interesting connections that urban science presents us with.
Yeah, thank you, Aromar. So should I take it over? So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mike. And I do appreciate and admire the diversity of your path and what it brings to this discussion. Thank you, Aromar, and the Institute for all the work that you do, but also for convening us in terms of the conference and this panel. I think we don't do this enough, particularly with the perspective from an Indian institute or an Indian city that just sort of scopes and frames our discussion in different ways. And this is very important, very useful. So I want to say a few things. The first thing I want to say is just introduce myself a little bit and the kind of work I do, which I think will help understand my other comments. And then I want to talk a little bit about the science part in urban science, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that. And I think we need to be clear about what we're trying to create. And then I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about inequality and informality, in some ways connected, but not just connected, because again, that's a complex, very important issue, and it's the theme of the conference here. And then I want to finish with a few comments about futures. So about particularly thinking about what sustainability means and the problems that we have, in some sense, trying to imagine these futures from a point of view of our best knowledge and how to get there. So the first point, I've had a path where I've touched many disciplines, partly out of my own intellectual curiosity and the ability to do that. So as Aromar said, I started as a physicist. And from physics, what I take is really an ability to create models and data and think very synthetically. But I was always very interested in people, right? Not just people I like individuals, but I'm most fascinated by what people in large numbers can do together and how they can change the world, sometimes in good ways, but how sometimes nothing happens, right? We have lots of people together, a lot is going on, but nothing happens, so to speak. So, and the best places to start asking these questions, I think, are cities, because cities are really places in terms of a human social organization that have created most changes, Jose emphasized, but where sometimes, in the moment when we look at our own cities, we feel that not enough is happening, particularly vis-a-vis the problems we perceive. So that's been my path. I'm now a professor of ecology and evolution, where I do theory of ecosystems and biodiversity and what evolution is in some sense. And I had a new institute at the University of Chicago that builds on a long history at the University of Chicago of studying cities. That history started very much locally with studies of Chicago in urban sociology. It's a famous work, if you know the history of the field. Had sort of a post-war period of sort of the quantitative revolution in geography, which is interesting, and that echoes a bit of the sort of introduction of quantitative methods back into urban science today, in some ways that are good and bad today. And then, of course, what we're trying to create, and this gets me into our topic, is really, if you allow me the shortcut, what I like to call sort of a 21st century version of what science should be, not just for urban science, but in general, right? So what I mean by that is that science is not a bunch of, white guys in lab coats trying to create sort of some product to deliver on a platter to society, but really a practice of looking at real world, real life, including the lives, as Debra said, of communities, of governments who are struggling. Be modest in face of that evidence, which is evidence, right? It's not just, of course, many things are context specific, but many things are really common problems that we all face. And work with that evidence and with people and with data and to try to create sort of a better understanding of how these systems work and how they might work in the future, right? So what's special about science in particular is that it's supposed to create generalizable knowledge. right? So that's the definition almost of what science is. And generalizable means that we are able to take the knowledge that we're supposed to have learned from this practice into entirely new situations that we don't have in our data today, don't have in our experience today. And this is where we imagine a sustainable world. We've never had a sustainable world. We've never had an equitable world or city. And so we have to understand how these systems work before we are able to, imagine how they could work in new directions. And so that's really what science is for. And I think urban science is forging the way in many ways about the practice of systems science in the way that, as Debra in particular emphasized, need to now incorporate many things, including, of course, social life and individual sort of cognition and agency, but then need to understand sort of systems of governance and economics, sort of at the mesoscale, and needs to understand then process of development, and of course our relationship with nature, which is changing and we want it to change. And so it's very big, right? This stuff is enormous and touches a bunch of disciplines across scales. And that really is the challenge. How is it that we both acknowledge what's been done so far, but bring all these points of view into a system that allows us to actually explain phenomena at different scales by putting things together? You actually create something simpler that makes more sense, that is more predictive. And so, for example, many problems of human development have to do with the fact that we don't understand how a person in a complicated, dynamical environment of a city makes decisions and is enabled or disabled by certain factors. It's a vexing problem. We face it all the time. But the fact is, without a better understanding of that and a true, engagement with real people in real situations, but also the methods of science, we're not going to solve it. Okay. I also want to emphasize, since we're in this moment in history, that science is really in my view, of course, I'm biased, but I think this is true, the biggest force for change. If you want change and if you want something different from what we've had before, you need to engage with science. And a lot of people sort of in the policy space and sometimes in other spaces don't like to engage with this process of learning and trying to figure out, how we may go ahead and do things differently. And so, if you look at COVID, right, are we going to be saved by our politicians, or are we going to understand what this virus is, how it transmits, and how it may be blocked? So with that said, I also want to say that the methods of science are not exclusive to people like us. They're actually practiced by people in the world, including people in government and people in communities. Okay? Sometimes we don't acknowledge this or recognize this, but it can be true. And so, for example, my own experience with communities and particularly and informality, I'll get to that in a moment, have had to do with a lot of a long-term engagement with communities, slum communities. They are part of the Slum Dwellers International Network, some of them in India, a lot of them in various African nations, mostly in cities. And they've developed their own method, which is many things, but among other things is basically the convening of a community, the elicitation of information and data. They do say, as Francis Bacon, that knowledge is power, because they feel that when they're able to do effectively a census of their own communities, they express the reality as they see them and express sort of an imagined future of what they need and what they think would be the things that are greatest priorities. They are essentially in a better position to negotiate with their authorities and government and so forth to create their path. And there are many examples where that has worked well, other examples where it's harder. But I just want to analyze that process a little bit, which may feel very parochial and very much to do with a community. But it's a community that's trying to create a hypothesis and recognize what the evidence is that goes beyond what each individual knows. When people come together and cross opinions, they actually are creating something that's sort of intersubjective and therefore, in some sense, the experienced reality of a group of people, which is just what scientists do. They collect evidence that allows them to test those ideas and express them to others. And then when the process really works, they also create sort of, if you will, hypotheses about what that future should be. And then as things develop, those are tested effectively. This is not always self-conscious, but it's really happening. And it's happening everywhere. Governments do this too. So that's the part about science. That's what we're talking about. And science, the point I want to make again, that I started with, is that if we can imagine future sustainable cities, we need to take these knowledge about how communities work, how people make decisions, how effectively these network processes work to a sustainable future. So what urban science in particular has told us through a long history of ideas, as Jose emphasized, but I think a big acceleration in the last few years that's due really, frankly, because the world's urbanizing. That means China and India and Africa, but also data and evidence from many, many different contexts that allows us to see what's general, but also what's particular, is that cities are essentially not places. They're not just the built environment. That's just helping. They're not governments. And we already said this, but cities really are built by people, Debra, as Debra said. You know, governments may help or hinder. They usually do both. But they have a big role in supporting a lot of things that happen in cities and making them possible through services, for example. But they're not usually the agents building the city or controlling the city. So cities are always balancing acts where we always have very stark, benefits and costs. And we're all trying to manage that both as individuals, as firms, as governments. So cities are connected places where people come together and interact with a lot of other people, sometimes through institutions. And cities, and this process embeds a lot of information, right? So this is very important, connectivity, information. So they're a process by which people can become different. They acquire specializations, they acquire new knowledge, they have to provide goods and services and knowledge to other people. And we become interdependent, even sometimes without realizing. And this network becomes very diverse because we all can do different things. And what arises is really a lot of the things that we sometimes think are bugs, but they're really features of cities. They're structural features that cities embody a process of change, because we're all trying to do this, processes of sustaining enormous diversity of people, activities, knowledge, and so forth, because we're all kind of being complementary to each other. And they embed this connectivity, social connectivity, that actually then supports things like agglomeration effects. They are sort of thought usually through as an economic effect, but it's an epiphenomenon of this connected network that also creates politics with capital P. It's an urban world, right? It means the stuff of cities. It creates civic organizations, and it creates sort of a more conscious view of different futures for these communities. And now we want to make that better. So that's what urban science already tells us. That allows us to make predictions about this, to build models, to incorporate data. And so it's very different from what you used to have in terms of models of cities that say as central markets in geography and economics, which abstract away all the social stuff and starts to sort of some simplistic epiphenomenon. It's very different from a model of utility where we abstract people's thinking, right? And motivations and pitfalls. And it's very different also from even sociology, say, of neighborhoods, where we see the inequality between people, but we don't see the city and why they're there in the first place, right? So again, it's only by going across scales and connecting all this that it makes sense. So let me segue a little bit to inequality and informality. I already said a little bit about it, so I can be a little faster. So inequality is a very difficult issue, as we know. It's very charged, and we come at it often with strong judgments about its many problems, which are real. But it's also very dynamical in cities. When a city is working, inequality is very dynamical. And I want to start by recognizing that cities historically have really been places that take on a lot of people that are disadvantaged, often very poor. And when a city is working, they create opportunities and pathways for those lives to be transformed. Whereas in a traditional setting where people are living a subsistence existence, those pathways don't exist, right? So cities are very important, again, in manifesting the process we've been talking about and that we understand increasingly scientifically as well as in our experience to the lives of individuals coming to the city. And so to the extent that that works, a city is doing a lot of good things, but may still appear like that it has a lot of poverty. And there are many studies of longitudinal sort of pathways and inequality in cities that manifest this. The problem about inequality in cities, so cities always have a lot of poor people and a lot of rich people. But the problem with inequality in cities is when it becomes static, when it's frozen, and where these opportunities are cut off. And this is connected often to the issue also of informality. Again, when informality becomes stuck and rigid, and sort of a rigid separation, instead of being a process in the stage by which the city is forming and creating opportunities. And this is where government, as well as also some economic phenomena, are very important, right? So the way we know cities can create these opportunities and pathways is by supporting people, by connecting them, if you allow me to use that word again, and by allowing them to not just be infrastructure and not just being, relying on just themselves, by having services that allow them to have housing, allow them to have water, allow them to have sanitation, allow them to, have justice and conflict resolution, right? And many other things. And when that works, then people are enabled as creative agents, perhaps entrepreneurial agents even, and people are very entrepreneurial in informal communities, to actually take that energy and that desire to change to a new scale. And that, again, gets manifested in the success of the city, as many people are able to do this. So again, if we don't understand cities as processes of change, where people are kind of trying to change what they do and embed information and connectivity, we don't understand when some of the signals that structurally appear unjust may actually be working for some people, and we don't know where to go to make them better, and we end up approaching the problem with a lot of normative expectations. The final thing I want to say, so this is to say that we're doing a lot of work with informality through the work I started talking about, and one of my concerns is that we're getting now a lot of data that is undermining a little bit, but also potentially reinforcing informal community organization in the spirit of trying to create leadership from the bottom up, from communities to the city, as to what cities should be. We're getting a lot of data, for example, from, it was mentioned by Michael, by satellite companies that have just mapped actually the entire built environment of Africa, which is something that no one's ever seen, right? And so what do we do with this information, and how is this going to enable communities and local governments to create good cities from a civic perspective versus, I don't know, technology, you can imagine technologists or land speculators from doing their usual thing, which creates cities quickly, but tends to create inequality. So there's a lot of rebalancing the world by using these new assets in a way that creates good processes that I think universities and people like us have a responsibility and a good role to play. So finally, let's imagine the future. So when we think about sustainability, right? So usually we think about three requisites. One is, obviously climate change. We need to change our relationship with the environment, decarbonize our economies and our energy systems, and preserve and maybe enhance biodiversity, right? So that's the environmental part. The equity part, which is a lot to do with inequality and opportunity, as we discussed. But still, we want to talk about prosperity, right? So in most parts of the world, but anywhere, if you ask also Americans who are more prosperous or Europeans, they want to continue to be more prosperous. But that's an imperative, of course, in poorer nations. So these processes, the main point here is that these processes have been seen by individual disciplines in the past to be in opposition to each other, right? That by growing, say, the economy, you have to destroy the environment, or you have to, or many people will tell you that the economy will grow faster if you tolerate more inequality. I don't know, I don't want to get into details, but you've heard these arguments. So at the same time, I think when you go to a community or a city, you see the political, the social, the economic hand in hand. You see the injustices, the opportunities, the things we've been talking about. So it seems clear that there should be an opportunity that these phenomena play together to create a better future. But that's not been manifested in science or theory that convinces a lot of people out there, particularly in policy, that sustainability is more than a good idea, that we have a path that actually creates all these three things in tandem. So what we have at the moment is basically that we need to create, so I think more rigorous ideas, but also a pathway for the introduction of technology and policy that allows us from the bottom up to produce cities and from their nations that are able to be sustainable. What we're doing at the moment is that in the US now with the new administration, we're expecting to move very quickly in that direction. There's going to be presumably a big policy package that's going to come now in February. And the idea is that the technology more or less is kind of ready. It will improve, but it's kind of ready in the sense that there have been a number of studies that we collaborate with and we part with in some cases that just are recommending to electrify everything so that we'll stop having fossil fuels as sources of energy, but also sources of moving cars and engines and industry and so forth. That we'll have to produce a lot more energy. This electrical energy will be produced through renewables. Renewables, again, are competitive now in most parts of the country. And that out of the, so this is a technology revolution in a way, but it has to produce equity. It has to be driven not just by markets and trickle-down introduction, but through essentially a civic movement that allows communities to live in better environments, but also find jobs and so forth. So this is to be done. But just to say it, in a place like the United States, we have in some sense the baseline of data, the ability to localize this kind of process in each community, but look at all communities together in order to form back cities and regions and the nation. and that we can in principle assess how these things come together with knowledge of what cities really are as systems of systems, and try to forge a path that's sustainable. But to do that, you need a big infrastructure of knowledge and activity and big networks of people collaborating, which ultimately I think is what this panel is about. So the last thing I want to say is that this is what urban science is for. Science ultimately, this is kind of paraphrasing Feynman, is to give you new frameworks to imagine a future where things that used to be really hard because we were looking just in front of our eyes, as we do with cities, become possible, become easier, right? That's what we're looking for in a body of science. And as Jane Jacobs also tells us, a lot of policy people see cities as a bunch of problems, but you should not see cities as a bunch of problems that you'll approach it immediately in the wrong way. You have to see them as all these complicated processes that create lots of good things and some bad things, and to understand them enough that they can be supported to create sustainable futures. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. So for those of us who are attending the session, I'll be glad if you put your questions into the chat, and then we can pick them up. But just a quick reflection. I think Luis said was really very useful. I think there were 3 or 4 big ideas. One, of course, the challenge, I guess, to build generalizable processes, not from from the courts, sort of academic kind of power, but really bottom up. I mean, I think that's a very interesting new perspective on urban science, that we now have the ability, because of a whole range of connectedness across the world, to really start these experiments of building up from community knowledges, community-based sciences, and much more local processes. And to generalize from that, the question, of course, is, like Jose was saying, and Michael was alluding to, and Debra was talking absolutely to experience. We don't actually have the knowledge infrastructures to make that happen, because it has to build itself up not only from the communities, but into public life, into into municipal institutions, into a whole range of into enterprises, etc. And those pathways, in a sense, all those institutional spaces are very rare at the current point. So I think that was a very useful contribution. Then the reminder to us that cities are about flows. They're about momentum, and when they freeze up, either because of challenges within the city or in the larger environment, you have huge ranges of issues, whether it's inequality or lack of access to just basic services or whatever it is. And I think managing and understanding and developing, let's say within quotes, a calculus of flows, and the flows are not only physical flows, there of ideas, of institutions and processes like that, would be something that we really need to get a much better handle on. And getting these conversations happening in diverse locations, like Michael was talking about, for us, the wonderful learning of how, let's say, Medellin was able to dig itself out of that, what happened post-apartheid, South Africa, or the transitions we've seen in Shenzhen, or even other cities in China that have worked themselves out. And of course, South Asia has its own particular issues as far as that's concerned. The question of imaginations, in a sense, using science to be able to construct the imaginations, which are not in models which are driven by sort of particular ideas of trade-offs. I mean, that I think was a very important and useful idea, that these changes are systemic. They have historically happened systemically, but we only look at elements of the process. We look at the built environment, or we look at other kinds of processes that are happening there, or the nature of power. We're not able to bring them together. So I think a better understanding of how we're able to enable the synergies, and in a sense step back from this framework of trade-offs, which is the environment is traded off with respect to economic development, and vice versa. I think we need much better examples of that. And like Jose sort of articulated earlier, it's not only the places where it's worked for a time. We have to study the boundary conditions, the extreme sort of events and the extreme processes, to understand how the breakdown takes place, because that's how the K alpha or the sort of emergence actually comes. So I'm really glad that you brought those things up. I'm just waiting for so we've got a few questions, I think, in chat. Of course, I guess for people who are attending the session, we're happy if you're able to unmute yourself and ask the panel questions. We have about 10-15 minutes to respond to them. We've got a very active set of experience there. So if you don't have questions that you put into the chat, if somebody wants to sort of open up and sort of show themselves or at least come on online, we'll be happy to take them. Let me give you maybe 15-20 seconds to find your tongues or your keyboards. Otherwise, I'll sort of turn it back to the panelists. Okay, I don't see anything there. So I mean, just hearing what's been said here, Debra and Jose and Michael. I mean, any responses? It's been a fairly rich conversation. We've gone into depth into a whole range of things. Debra, do you want to sort of any reflections, comments?
Thanks, Zara. And I mean, this has just been such a rich conversation. I suppose the one thing I'd like to emphasize particularly, and perhaps we haven't emphasized it enough, is the particularly high barrier that politics can set. And I think Luis mentioned, politics, or Michael, politics with the big P. Because yes, indeed, cities are places of change, but we need them to change to take on board that generalizable knowledge, which, as Luis has indicated, we can generate in a number of different locales now because of technology and access. Science itself is a process of change. It's our way of understanding the world, an important way of understanding the world, but it needs to change in terms of what it focuses on, what it funds, the scale at which it works. And so you need intermediaries, number one, that are able to bridge across that divide. And that's a really important issue, because we're not training enough people to be those bridge builders, to be those intersectional elements. But the problem is, once you bridge those great divides, there are many political setups that don't really appreciate that more generalizable knowledge coming in, because it affects power bases. Trade-offs are really important at the local level. And the importance of trade-offs is that's a win-lose situation. And very often existing power bases are structured around the people who are winning in those particular trade-offs. They don't want that changed. And that is often an enormous barrier. And I think we're often scared when we talk about urban science. We're quite comfortable talking about models, data, communities. We are less comfortable talking about the power and the politics, which actually mediate where that comes from, how it comes into the process of governance within cities, and how it changes the way that cities operate, because people don't like change. And what we're calling for, you've heard us, we've literally been a chorus asking for change at a variety of scales and a variety of modalities. And yet the very thing people like the least, and we've seen this in the pandemic often, is change. And I think that's the problem, is we really haven't grappled with the politics, not only of these two forces of urbanization and science coming together in a new integrated way, but the politics of, once that knowledge is received, of how it actually imbalances existing power bases and active fight back around that. So it's not a value neutral situation where once the knowledge is generated, it comes in and it's well received and it changes things. There are real barriers. And I think often those who delve in urban science are perhaps not as keen in getting into the messy politics of it. Thanks, Ara.
Thanks, Debra. I think the other question, apart from the politics, which I think we have a lot of understanding on the panel, is the question of proposition. I mean, one of the classical views of science is that science, in a sense, it doesn't necessarily propose. Design proposes, and politics, in some senses, proposes. So when we're trying to deal with competing imaginaries, the dynamics of proposition is, I think, an important part of what we're trying to reach out for here, because that's where the integration, and that's where some of the politics has actually sort of played itself out. Michael, any sort of any closing comments, any reflections on this?
Yeah, well, I pick up on what you're saying, Eric, because I think it's really important, and something that Louise and Debra said, that the propositional is incredibly important in this moment, and the proposition always builds on something. It doesn't start from nothing. So the propositional is always specific. So I strongly agree with Louise's point earlier that we look for generalizable knowledge, but we look for generalizable knowledge that creates propositions in context where something exists already. And I think that's quite important, not least for, like Debra mentioned, the politics, and the political horizon is always the timescales of these things are incredibly important in this. And so as Louise said, cities always have both poverty and opportunity as well as affluence. And one can make interventions which improve lives. And so it may not matter so much if there is, as Louise said, unblocked mobilities in many senses of that term. But it's also the case that not only is the political horizon sometimes limited, but the technological horizons are also quite disruptive. So just give one very quick example. You can think about public health, and you can construct a perfect distribution of primary care facilities based on any one moment in time, a synchronic snapshot. But there's quite a lot of evidence that says that medical technologies tend to move faster than real estate. So the city is a system of systems, as we heard, but the system of land, which one of the commentators in the chat has built up, the system of land disposal and use and distribution and marketing and planning tends to move at a slower pace than the pace of technology. So your ideal distribution of public health, as with many other aspects of the city, needs to be flexible. It needs to be adaptable and have a disposition that responds to rapid change. And that itself is both incredibly interesting, but it can be informed by the science in a way that I think can be quite inspiring. But it comes from your point that we need to think about the propositional in that sense.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the thing that's coming out from this is, we're talking about systems of systems, and obviously because it's a multi-layered and sort of nested kind of process, slow and fast dynamics will play themselves out against that. And unfortunately, in our particular context, we do need to be able to study and understand how these slow and fast dynamics enable emergence. We can see the sort of epiphenomena, as Louis said, of the emergence, but the underlying drivers and how they deal with stuff and how decision-making and contests and, convergence happen is something that we, actually, frankly, there are not enough behavioral scientists who work on this question within the urban science space. And I think between that and more politics, I think we'll get some very interesting sets of questions, if not answers, in some ways. Jose, some closing reflections on what you've heard on, how do we take this into education? How do we build this new generation of people who connect and bridge places? I mean, that's what we're trying to do at IIHS. We've tried to set up this university to do precisely that. But we need that in 10,000 places, and we need that like now, if we're going to get anywhere by 2030. So,
well, I was actually going to say, that there's an urgency. The intellectual curiosity built in urban science is accompanied by a sense of urgency that there are many, many features of sustainable urbanization that we really need to get a good understanding soon, and we need to get that knowledge out there, so to speak, also very soon. Now, it's an interesting, maybe as a result of that urgency, there might be beginning already to be seeds of change. So, for example, just recently, Luis and I were involved in putting together a proposal to the NSF. The NSF put out a funding for research on sustainable regional systems. And this call was the first time in the history of NSF that, that among the criteria for what will make a good proposal, one of the criteria was you academics have to engage with people are at the forefront of actually carrying out this transition. And that was very interesting. And let me tell you, it did not make it easier to put together the proposal that we actually had to demonstrate. Now, it's only one call, but change has to start somewhere. I just want to say that from the standpoint of the National Science Foundation in the United States, it's a very significant change to ask for stakeholder, for quote, meaningful stakeholder engagement. I think that's a consequence of this widespread realization that if we're going to do good science, that science has to be informed by actual problems and challenges. There's a lot of knowledge that's not to be found in the academic hallways that we need to tap into. And if that science is going to meaningfully inform policymaking in a realistic time frame, that gap between us academics and practitioners, so to speak, has to be shortened somehow. I think we're beginning to see some steps in that direction. And I think, of course, we have to build upon them. But I think we need to use this sense of urgency. And this sense of urgency is going to be our battering ram, so to speak, to well, I don't know what you can do about the walls of Oxford. Those walls have been up for a long, long time. But we need to batter the walls in university to bring to bear this notion that we need a new education. It has to be transdisciplinary. And the training that we have to give the next generation of scientists, by the way, is not only new techniques, new methods, as Rich was describing. We need to train them to meaningfully engage with stakeholders. And this gets me then to my last point, because I think it's going to be terribly important that urban science not only be good science, but that it becomes an instrument to better the lives of everyone in cities, not just the elite. And that has been a concern that some of us have had, that sometimes urban science is confused with urban big data, and that often those efforts really are aimed at making cities better for the elite. So I think we scientists, in addition to our commitment that our science has to be good, and it cannot just be, a political instrument, but we have to be prepared to go out there so that our science does become an instrument in the hands of the poor. And then lastly, as Rich says, to do away with this sometimes mythical barrier that exists around science, that science is this very obscure practice that only people who've been studying for 20 years and get a PhD. And as Rich says, as long as we all have a commitment to asking questions, letting those questions be subject to the harsh judgment of data, and then revising what we do, we're all scientists. And I think is again, something that we ought to really strive for. I'm optimistic that we can do it, but we have to do it soon.
Yeah, Jose, that's really important. But I think the interesting thing that we're seeing is the demand that's coming from certainly city leadership. Debra and I work with both UCLG and ICLE on this question. And city leadership is really asking for this. We ran a very important convening in Edmonton a few years ago, which brought the science community and the city community together. It was a shock for them to realize that we were talking, like you said, about the same agenda. There's a demand coming really very actively from local government, which national government doesn't necessarily see and hear. So I'm hoping at some point of time we really get the local kind of innovation and partnerships at city or regional level that don't necessarily have to go to National Science Foundations to actually happen. Debra, you're going to respond to, we're kind of running a little bit out of time. You're going to respond to Rohit's important question, and then I'll ask Luis to close off before we shut things down. You're muted, Debra.
Yeah, sorry about that. And I think the issue around politics is absolutely vital, because it's through the mechanism, whether we like it or not, of politics that we actually transform the world. Everything runs through conduits, and currently the process that we work in indicates that the end game is a political one. And I think it just echoes everything that we have been saying on this panel. There's a knitting together that needs to happen, an acknowledgement that there are many knowledges out this, and Ara, you and I, sort of fight this battle constantly in the IPCC of, in broadening that understanding of what science and knowledge is and how it is assessed, and what should be pulled into that assessment to allow us to point to what the choices are that decision makers have. But I think we've also got to break down barriers, and Ara, this is as well as I do. Science for a very long time has protected itself, and certainly the policymakers have limited the change they want to be subjected to by saying that science should be policy relevant and not prescriptive. Exactly. And I think we're going to have to start tearing down those walls, because I think we're getting to the point where the facts coming from the kind of science that Jose is indicating through observation, growing data sets, indicates that there are some fundamental things that are now statements of fact, and those indicate change. And I think in many ways the science community needs to become braver about beginning to push against those policy walls that are quite resistant to change. And again, I think that's an important thing for us to realize, is science has to get a lot braver if it's going to affect this kind of change. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So Luis, closing comments. We're talking about,
Sure.
tearing down lots of different kinds of walls here. I think we're moving from some medieval to a pre-modern kind of future. Yeah.
Yes. So I think again, hopefully, I mean, you know, where do we tear down walls, right? And I think the answer is partly, if not mostly, again, in urban environments, right? Urban environments can have lots of walls, and we know about that. But there are also places where rich and poor people of all kinds of cultures and ethnicities and professions live side by side, and whether they want it or not, end up influencing each other and interacting. And it's part of that sort of that structure, that process, that often these walls are torn down. It's very difficult for a city to be doing well, even in some rough sense, without sort of that tension. That tension is very generative. Sometimes it feels negative, but it's actually what's generating change. Is the fact that we perceive, for example, injustice in a city, right? That we end up creating a democracy, you know, the idea of democracy, and then in various flawed implementations, you know, services. All these things are urban inventions, right? And so that's important. And then they spread to other processes, but they're really addressing difficult, ever-present problems, right? That we're always trying to kind of struggle through. So I don't want to minimize that, but I'm saying that it's not an end goal, it's a process. And this process, for cities that work well, that doesn't mean that they look pretty, right? Those tensions are there and those problems are there, but it means that somehow we're addressing them. And that's the process, that's the walk. I want to, Debra, I sympathize with what you said about politics, but I also want to say a couple of things. I think politics too is a process like that, hopefully. A mayor of a previous city where I lived, not this present city, told me once, when we were having a conversation a bit like this, that he said, Luis, remember this. And I did. Politicians don't lead, they follow, okay? So you think of the heroic politician, right? That's gonna take us to the rainbow. But in fact, what he told me is that politicians are always looking for some angle, some new idea that can distinguish themselves and that will deliver sort of, you know, them as the prophet of that message. And I think this is where sort of the ideas that are being created about cities, including by us, but by communities and governments and examples from other places, are starting to feed, hopefully, at least in many places, a certain competition by politicians to also be sort of the standard bearers of some of these ideas of cities that are kind of driven by community well-being, by ecological well-being. And I think in that sense, what I see, maybe it's too optimistic, but I think it's true in the last 10 years or so, is that there's a certain sense that cities are becoming self-conscious almost for the first time because of this global movement, because everyone's talking about cities. They're understanding that they're really critical to change in each nation, that they're in many ways heading the revolution towards sustainability. You know, there are many examples of this. Certainly in the US, the big cities have done a lot of that, at least on paper, and also a little bit in reality. And so this self-conscious, this growing a little bit confidence of what could happen in a city towards these imagined futures, I think is very important. It's not always, you know, realized immediately, but it's starting to set the direction that also will set a bit of what is acceptable politics. So I think but it needs ideas and support and methods to be able to actually realize its potential. And I think that's where we all come in. And I'm at least optimistic that with, you know, fits and starts, that's the path.
Good, wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you for people who've been on this for a little bit more than the time we expected. I hope that we can pick this up. I mean, this is something that we should pick up, let's say, every few months and build on in the multiple geographies that there. And I think many other colleagues would be really happy to, from other geographies. I mean, you know, people from East Asia, from Latin America, to pick up this and take this forward. So thanks for spending the time with us, and thanks for getting up really early in the morning for some of you, and taking your afternoons and others. So
thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.
Sarah, bye everyone.
It goes down. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye.